Hello and welcome back to the seemingly never-ending series on how to test for inflammation, something that should be a simple question, and yet it is not. For those of you who don't know, this is part 3 of a 3-part series. In the first video, I told you about inflammation, what we're looking for, what we're measuring, and how to make the most out of these tests. If you order the test and you don't really know what you're looking for or how to use them or what it means, you're not going to have actionable information and you're not going to be able to treat the inflammation. So definitely go back and watch that video first. In the second video, I covered the commonly, conventionally available lab tests that are available through LabCorp or Quest or your primary care doctor's office. These are the tests that I use most frequently. And you might even have had some of these run on your body already, things like C-reactive protein and homocysteine and sedimentation rate and many, many more. If you haven't watched that video, go check it out. And in this video, this is where you're like, all right, I want to go to the next level. I want to do the functional fancy schmancy test and I want to really get a deep dive on inflammation. Bring it on. These are the functional medicine tests for inflammation. And I will say, some of them are quite good. And some of them are absolutely hot garbage for reasons that will be made more clear if you watch the first video first before you watch this one. So assuming that you've watched the other videos, let's get right into the functional medicine testing for inflammation. Before we get into the individual markers though, I want to just preface it by telling a little bit of background about functional medicine. So the idea behind functional medicine, this is sometimes true and sometimes not depending on the provider. The idea with functional medicine, the claim to fame of functional medicine, is that we treat the body holistically. So we're not just going to laser in on your diagnosis or one specific tissue. We're going to look at your entire body and make sure that everything is working together harmoniously. That being said, if you look at inflammation as immune reactivity or sources of stress or dysfunction in the body, then we can kind of take a step back and look at a lot of things through the lens of inflammation. Again, it might not be quite the same as like elevated C-reactive protein or elevated homocysteine, but if you think about it through that functional medicine lens of just a stressor on the body or a dysfunction in the body, we could look at the presence of toxins as inflammation, right? Like, and you could think of a really overt case of this. If you had lead poisoning, you'd be inflamed. If you had arsenic exposure, you would be inflamed. So the presence of toxins is inherently inflammatory. So maybe you don't even need to measure all these other things. You already know you're inflamed. Similarly, if you have the presence of an infection, like a confirmed actual infection. I'm not talking about dysbiosis, that's a little different, but like tangentially related. And I'm not talking about like Epstein-Barr antibodies, because that's like a whole nother thing that's very complicated to interpret and determine if it's really an honest to goodness current infection or if it's a past infection. I'm talking about like current infection with COVID, current infection with Epstein-Barr virus, confirmed, viral PCR or early antigen for EBV, a GI infection, a parasitic infection. And again, yes, dysbiosis to some degree is in this clump too, but the presence of an infection is going to rev up the immune response and create inflammation. So it's inherently inflammatory. Similarly, your body's not going to be able to work correctly, and it's not going to be able to do all of its jobs and regulate its machinery if you have deficiencies. So just being vitamin D deficient or iron deficient or B12 deficient or zinc deficient, any of those things, a nutritional deficiency is inherently inflammatory because your body's not going to work right. I would even argue that a deficit in calories or a deficit in protein or fat or carbs, any of the micronutrients, is also inherently inflammatory. So we can kind of take a big step back and think about inflammation on that really broad level of like, do you have disease or dysfunction or deficiencies or toxins or infections? Is your body dealing with something that is inherently inflammatory? That being said, I don't think that's why you're watching this video. I think that this is more for the left brain nerds who like want the data and you want to track stuff. So that being said, I totally jive with you people. Let's get into some more of the actual like data points that you can measure instead of just using your right brain and saying, yeah, I'm inflamed. So the first one in the functional medicine space that I wanted to make mention of is glutathione. And I'm too lazy to write the word glutathione, so I'm just going to write GSH. So just now you know that that's the abbreviation for glutathione. Glutathione is available through LabCorp or Quest. You can measure it in blood work through LabCorp or Quest. I very rarely see it run that way. The only time I really see that run in LabCorp or Quest blood work is if somebody's doing like a big Sears mold panel, but otherwise I don't see it very commonly run. More frequently, I'm going to see total glutathione on something like a NutrEval from Genova, for example. It's going to be on one of these big like functional medicine panels that has a bunch of other stuff. But glutathione is your most important and most abundant intracellular antioxidant, meaning it's inside the cells. It's super important for detoxification, for the immune system to function. It's an antioxidant, it's a detoxifier, it's a chelator, it's neuroprotective, it's GI protective. There's even some research that you will not get leaky gut syndrome until you first deplete glutathione, which is so cool. Like there's so much. If you want to take a deep dive on something fascinating, just Google glutathione. It's fascinating. But because it's a really important antioxidant, if you have low glutathione status, then we can infer that your body is soaking up all of that antioxidant and using it all up because you have inflammation. It's similar. In my last video, I mentioned that that might be the case for uric acid. I think that that's probably true of uric acid as well, although I don't know the state of the research on that theory. That is something that I hypothesize. So glutathione, available through a myriad of functional tests. I typically would see this in the NutrEval. The next one I wanted to make mention of is CoQ10 or coenzyme Q10. Similar idea. This is an antioxidant. And if you are lacking in an antioxidant, then you are probably oxidized and you're more inflamed. Of note, from here on, like CoQ10 and the next few that I'm going to talk about, I would deem these more relevant to oxidative stress and free radical style inflammation as opposed to immune mediated inflammation. A lot of the conversation from video 2 with the acute phase reactants, that was much more immune-mediated inflammation. Glutathione is kind of like halfway between the two worlds. It is important for the immune system, so I would tend to clump it more with that. But from CoQ10 onward, think a little bit less with the immune system. Think more like metabolic stress and like oxidation and free radicals and that sort of style and damage. CoQ10 can be deficient because you don't take in enough of it. You can get it from food. The biggest reason for that deficiency is going to be that you take statin medications, which are cholesterol lowering medications. And before you get excited, the hippy dippy people, if you take red yeast rice extract supplements, does the same damn thing. So this is an example where natural does not equal superior. It's just a different way to accomplish the same thing that the statin drugs do. So if you're on a cholesterol lowering medication, I would strongly consider trying to get off of that with the help of your provider who prescribed it, because it depletes CoQ10 and that's intrinsically inflammatory and not good. The next one that I'm also just going to abbreviate because I'm lazy is lipid peroxidation. I'm just going to put lipid per because I'm a bum and I don't want to draw it all. So lipid peroxidase or peroxidation of lipids is basically the lipids that make up your cell membranes start to go rancid. You can think of it that way for simplicity's sake. What really happens is that there's so many free radicals and inflammation floating around that they literally steal an electron from the fatty acids that make up your cell membranes. So that's really what happens, is that you've got all these reactive oxygen species and inflammation, and they start stealing electrons, and that makes the lipids in your cell membranes more unstable. But you can get lipid peroxidation markers. Again, the Genova NutrEval is one of the tests that does do that. And that is something that I've seen before. It's a nice marker of inflammation from like the reactive oxygen species kind of standpoint. The next one, kind of vaguely similar lines. Again, all of these are quasi-related, so just keep that in mind, is called 8-OHDG. I believe the G is capitalized. It might be lowercase. Don't quote me. So this is a marker of DNA damage secondary to reactive oxygen species. So same idea. The reactive oxygen species, the inflammatory stuff, is floating around and doing damage. And as it's stealing electrons from other molecules, because it's unstable and it needs to be stabilized and needs electrons, it steals electrons and pulls it from DNA, and it damages your DNA. So you can think of these as being kind of the same thing, but in one case, the tissue target that's being damaged is the cell membranes and the cell lipid bilayer, and in this case, it's actually the DNA. Oftentimes one and the same, but this is where like antioxidants and vitamins like vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin A, like all of the antioxidant type nutrients would be really effective, probably polyphenols, anything, fish oil, anything anti-inflammatory, particularly of the nutritional variety, is probably going to be really helpful here. And of note, these are both going to go up if you eat a lot of processed fats like trans fats and omega-6s. These are going to go up if you eat a lot of like grilled food or charred, burnt food. So, you know, the person in your family who, you know, if you burn all the cookies or if you burn the chicken on the grill and you're like, oh, I should throw this away, it's not healthy for us. And then the one person's like, oh, I'll eat that burned chicken, that's great. Yeah, that's really not good. Those are reactive oxygen species, and those are really nasty, and they tend to do a lot of this sort of damage. So eating burnt food and charred food, we have known this for a long time, is not good. Eating too much processed meat like bacon and lunch meats, similarly not good for us for one of many reasons, but this is one of the big ones. Things like smoking or exposure to toxins, exposure to secondhand smoke and smog, all of these like kind of traditionally thought of inflammatory things oftentimes do this sort of damage. It's the oxidative stress, reactive oxygen species float around and they damage tissues and they start damaging your membranes and your DNA and your bodily structures. The last one I'll mention here for, again, in the functional tests that are not hot garbage category is the omega-3/6 ratio. This I've seen many different places. It's on the Genova NutrEval. I'm not paid by Genova, I just like the test. It is on other tests. I know that there was a lab at least a few years ago where they do a finger stick and they give you the omega-3/6 ratio. I thought that was really cool. I just didn't use them a lot. So I don't know if they're still around, but there used to be a finger stick for omega-3/6 ratio, which is nice. But this has quite a bit of research on it and validity as well. And you could get that done through several different functional lab tests. So the omega-3/6 ratio, omega-3s being traditionally thought of as good, omega-6s, most of them are bad, with one notable exception, but that's another story for another day. Now, the two that I want to mention in the hot garbage category. So I'm going to start by saying, I am one person, this is my opinion. So don't get all your panties in a bunch. I'm trying to balance like ego and honesty and on all these factors. I'm not an immunologist. I wouldn't say I'm an immunology expert in the traditional sense of an expert. Like I don't have a PhD in immunology. I'm not a practicing immunologist. That being said, I know a pretty fair amount about the immune system. I've taken dedicated coursework for years about the immune system. I think I'm pretty savvy with the whole like Th1, Th2, Th3, Th17, Th9, all of that stuff. And I would talk to anybody and everybody about the different functions of mast cells and dendritic cells and T cells and B cells and all of that crap. There are two types of tests, and actually I'm going to erase the one half of the board real quick. You'll see why in just a second. There is an emerging world of functional testing. It's making a comeback. It used to be a little bit more of a thing a few decade or so back. And it's kind of re-emerging in the last, I would say, 2 to maybe 3 years. Hold on, let me draw the picture of the person again. I'm going to be lazy and just draw it this way. So here's our stick figure. So remember from video 1 that you should have watched by now. Immune function and therefore inflammation is largely compartmentalized. So if you sprain your ankle, you're going to have inflammation in the ankle, but not necessarily in your head. If you have an issue with your liver, it's not necessarily always going to be abundantly apparent in the blood, et cetera, et cetera. So the two types of testing that I'm seeing make a comeback in the last 2 to 3 years are cytokine testing and T and B cell, like Th1, Th2 type testing. Most notably, not to name names, but I'm going to name names, the cytokine panel was brought back to life a few years ago by Diagnostic Solutions Lab. That is the lab that does the famous GI map stool test that everybody and their brother adores, and I have very mixed emotions on. Side note, I'm going to have a new video about the GI map really soon. Stay tuned. The cytokine panel, so basically you would see that come back, and it would be, they would give you levels of like Th1, IL-1, IL-6, IL-4, IL-22, IL-17, IL-17A, and they give you all of these different TNF-alpha, they give you all of these different cytokines. And remember, cytokines are the signaling molecules for the immune system. You can think of them sort of analogously to hormones for the immune system. Kind of a similar idea. They get dumped out into the bloodstream, dumped out into the tissues, and then they communicate between immune cells. The problem with both of these, but especially the cytokine thing, is that cytokines, their main purpose almost always is to help a certain type of cell replicate so that you have a big army of immune cells, or they tell immune cells where to go. So in the example from the first video that I mentioned, sorry, that's annoying. Remember my story where I sprained my ankle? Well, I had swelling, redness, pain, tenderness, immobility, all located in that right ankle. I didn't have those symptoms anywhere else because what was happening is my capillaries became leaky and it was letting immune cells infiltrate the tissue in my ankle, and they were going in and gobbling stuff up like little Pac-Men, and they were helping to clear away the dead debris from the injury. You don't want all of your capillaries in your entire body to become leaky simultaneously. Like you'll pass out from low blood pressure if that happens. Similarly, you don't want all of your immune cells to leave your blood and just go out into the tissue all at once. You want that to happen in the location where they are needed, not globally throughout all of your body and all of your bloodstream. So the problem I have with this is the cytokine thing. Just because we can measure cytokines in the blood does not mean that it's clinically actionable information. See what I did there? Information quite yet. There are some research studies where they'll measure IL-4 and IL-6 and IL-1 beta, but I don't know if we're quite there yet clinically. The main reason being is that immune function and inflammation and cytokine activity is very localized to the target tissue. If you have COVID, you've got the cytokine storm in your lungs, not necessarily in your ankle. If you have, a sprained ankle, it's going to be mostly in your ankle, not necessarily in your spleen. Well, spleen's a bad example. Pinky finger. I have to pick a better organ because the spleen is part of the immune system. It's basically a big lymph node. Anyway, I'm getting carried away. But you get the idea. So the reason why I don't like either of these two tests is because the immune system is compartmentalized, and I don't know if we can really ascertain a lot of usable information by measuring the number of Th1 cells or the number of Th2 cells or the amount of IL-6 or the amount of IL-4 floating around in your bloodstream. As a secondary tangent note, they classify some of the cytokines incorrectly in that Diagnostic Solutions test, and it just drives me bonkers. I forget which one it is now, but there's one that they label anti-inflammatory and it's not. It's a Th2 cytokine, which is kind of debatable. Anyway, my big issue is that the immune system, it's hard to get usable information on the immune system and on target tissues if we're just capturing the sample from your bloodstream, because that's not going to be reflective of what's happening at the tissue level. So in my opinion, both of these are hot garbage. Who knows, maybe they will advance and maybe my opinion will change in future years, but knowing what I know right now about the body and immunology and inflammation, and clinically, I just don't think we're at a place where these tests make sense. These do. Oh, I forgot I erased them. Darn it. The things like glutathione, CoQ10, lipid peroxidase, 8-OHDG, omega-3-6 ratio, all of the stuff from the second video that we talked about, those all are very validated in research and clinically validated. They're very useful. Pass on these ones, save the couple $100, you don't need them. Oh, and I was going to say to rat out another company. So the cytokine panel that I've seen is from Diagnostic Solutions Lab. The Th1, Th2, etc. panel that I've seen most notably is from Cyrex Labs. Now I will say occasionally I do run T and B cell and natural killer panels on people, but that's kind of for a different purpose, and I'm fishing for something a little bit different. And I don't really know the confidence I have in our ability to differentiate between the T helper cells in a blood sample quite yet. But again, we'll see. We'll see if they convince me otherwise. But I heard a lecturer speak on this topic more recently, and I was not impressed by his knowledge of immunology. So between that and my initial hesitancy to try to get this kind of testing done in blood, I am not recommending these two at this time. And that's a wrap for real this time. This is part 3 of a 3-part series. Can we just laugh at past Nikki? Past Nikki, naive Nikki, yesterday thought that this was going to be a single video. And then as I started writing the notes, I was laughing at myself because I realized this needs to be 3 videos. This would have been like an hour-long video. It would have been absurd. Well, I hope that this outrageously long series, and particularly the second video, which was really long, I hope that it's been helpful and insightful, and I hope that it helps you on your healing journey. I think probably a lot of you have some sort of inflammation, whether it is localized to one tissue, like your small intestine, for example, or your colon, or if it is something that you can measure in a blood or a urine test, that's up for debate. But if it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. Don't let other people tell you that you're not inflamed when you know that you're inflamed. It doesn't mean that turmeric is going to help every single person watching this video, but it does mean that you can listen to your gut and just know what you're dealing with based off of symptoms. And if you want to support that with some degree of lab testing, then great. These can be helpful and insightful and just fascinating and fun to run, but don't feel like you have to run all of these tests to determine if you're inflamed, particularly if you know in your heart of heart that you are inflamed. So until next time, guys, let me know in the comments down below, have you had any of these tests run? Have you had something done like the OAT or the NutrEval or any of these like big panels that I mentioned that have some of these inflammatory markers from a functional perspective? Have you had the cytokine or the Th1, Th2 type panels done from Diagnostic Solutions or Cyrex? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, if it was helpful for you. It just, my kind of stance right now is that I don't think it would be helpful or worth the couple $100 that it would cost you. But I'm curious to hear your experience above all else. If it helped you, then that's all that really matters. But let me know what you want to see in future videos. I'm always taking suggestions. I have my little mad scientist list of YouTube video ideas that I keep, and I've got several hundred more videos that I want to make for you guys in the future. So let me know what you want, what's on your wish list, and I'll see if I can incorporate that into my fall 2022 recording schedule. Until next time, I will see you in the next video. Hey, but wait, I forgot to tell you one thing really quickly. I did a cliche YouTuber thing and I got on Patreon. I know. So really quick though, to tell you the story about that, some of you guys were so sweet in the comments recently, commenting that I should really get on Patreon and that you would like to thank me for making all of these videos for all of these years. And I just want to say thank you. Like, those comments really, truly make my day when I see them. But then I started thinking, I was like, yeah, that's not a bad point. Like, maybe some of you don't want to work with me or do FODMAP Freedom necessarily, but maybe you want to be a Patreon. So for those of you who want to do that and just support me, support the channel and my projects, thank you. We also have a Discord level and a monthly Q&A level. So if you want to get a little bit more one-on-one help from me and ask some questions and get some answers, then that is available. But ultimately, I'm viewing the Patreon not necessarily as a source of income, because I still have my private consulting and my FODMAP Freedom coaching group. But more what I'm thinking of is that this will help offset the cost of some of the big projects that I do on this YouTube channel. So a lot of you guys know right now I'm doing my big microbiome prebiotic experiment, and that encompassed me paying about $3,000 to get 50 stool tests. And I'm doing back-to-back stool testing and different prebiotics in the name of trying to understand what they do to my microbiome and giving you guys some insight into the changes that you might see with your microbiome. But I do think if I keep doing big mega projects like that, eventually my husband is going to harass me more, because he damn near had a heart attack when he saw $3,000 worth of poop test on our credit card bill. So I figured I would do the Patreon, as a way to say thank you to the people who want to say thank you. Thank you for supporting me in this channel and watching these videos all these years. But also this will help fund some of my projects, because I want to do a lot more of those experiments where I'm either testing things sequentially or I'm doing side-by-side comparisons where I want to do some split testing where we order the same exact test on the same exact person, three different tests from the same exact sample of blood or stool or whatever it might be, and we send them all to the lab with different names, and we see what comes back. I think that there's a lot of problems in the functional medicine lab space, honestly. I hate to say that, but I think that probably when we do that sort of experiment, we're going to get a lot of results that are going to be very disappointing. So right now, the first one in that series I decided to do is on the GI map. I have a couple of people that I'm having do side-by-side GI map tests and some LabCorp and Quest tests, and we're mailing them all out, the same person, same day, same stool sample, and we're going to send them out and see if the GI map stacks up against itself and these other more validated lab tests, because I have suspected for a long time that the GI map is woefully inadequate and inaccurate for many of the markers that they claim to test. So the first one should be out in the next week or two, depending on when all those samples and test results come back in. So keep your eyes peeled. I'm chomping at the bit to share that one, but there are some other tests that I'm thinking about doing the same thing with in the future. So this was a long way of saying thank you to all of the people who joined on Patreon, and I look forward to bringing you more great videos very soon. Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.